Edward Carson sat in his luxurious penthouse, overlooking the Manhattan skyline. The sound of clinking glasses and forced laughter echoed through the space. His friends, if he could call them that, were all there, sipping his expensive champagne and devouring canapés prepared by a renowned chef. But Edward couldn't join in the superficial joy that surrounded him. His eyes scanned the room, observing the people supposedly close to him. He saw John, a Wall Street executive, boasting about his latest acquisition, a yacht that cost more than many people earn in a lifetime. Sarah, a socialite, talked excitedly about her upcoming shopping trip to Paris. And there was Michael, a corporate lawyer, discreetly asking Edward about potential investments. All of them were there for one reason: Edward's money. His fortune, built over decades in the business world, was like a magnet attracting people with ulterior motives. Edward felt a wave of nausea rise in his throat. He stood up abruptly, muttering an excuse about needing fresh air, and walked out onto the balcony. The cool New York night air hit him, bringing momentary relief, but the feeling of isolation persisted. Edward looked down at the city below, millions of lights twinkling like earthly stars. How many of those people had true friends? How many were as lonely as he was, even surrounded by others? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his phone. It was a message from his brothers, Tom and Brian, asking to meet the next day to discuss family matters. Edward sighed. He knew what that meant: more talk about money, more plans to expand the Carson family fortune. The next day, Edward met with Tom and Brian at an exclusive restaurant. The conversation started as always, with pleasantries and superficial questions about business. But soon, as Edward had predicted, the topic shifted to the family inheritance. "Eddie, we've been thinking," Tom began, leaning across the table. "With the family assets growing so much, we need to be more strategic about how we manage it in the future." Brian agreed, adding, "We have some ideas on how we can optimize our tax situation. Nothing illegal, of course, but there are ways to make sure as much as possible stays in the family." Edward listened in silence as his brothers outlined their plans. Offshore funds, shell companies, strategic donations to reduce taxes. It all sounded like more of the same. More greed, more manipulation, more focus on money above all else. As Tom and Brian spoke, Edward felt something inside him break. This wasn't the life he wanted. It wasn't the legacy he wished to leave. He remembered his father, a man who started with nothing and built an empire not just to get rich, but to make a difference in the world. Where was that ideal now? That night, back in his empty apartment, Edward made a decision. He couldn't continue living like this, trapped in a gilded cage of his own making. He needed a new beginning, a chance to rediscover who he truly was, far from the expectations and manipulations of his current life. With trembling hands, Edward began writing a letter to his family. In it, he expressed his deep disappointment with the direction their lives had taken, the obsession with money and status that had eroded the values their parents had tried to instill in them. He spoke about the loneliness he felt, even while being at the top of the world. As the words flowed, Edward felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He was taking control of his life again, even if it meant leaving everything behind. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in years, he felt a spark of hope. As he finished the letter, Edward looked out the window at the city that never sleeps. Tomorrow, Edward Carson, the billionaire, would disappear. In his place, a man in search of redemption and meaning would be born. With one last look at his luxurious apartment, Edward prepared to embark on the most important journey of his life. Edward acted quickly and decisively. In the days that followed, he discreetly sold most of his valuable possessions, converting them into cash he could use untraceably. His artwork, luxury cars, and properties around the world were liquidated through trusted intermediaries. He kept only enough to survive on the streets for a considerable time. With a backpack containing only essentials, a few changes of clothes, a sleeping bag, and basic supplies, Edward left his apartment for the last time. He looked back briefly, remembering all the extravagant parties and business meetings that had taken place there. Now, it all seemed empty and meaningless. He walked through the streets of New York, blending in with the crowd. For the first time in decades, no one recognized him. There were no looks of admiration or envy, only the typical indifference of hurried New Yorkers. Edward felt a strange sense of freedom. As the day wore on, Edward looked for a place to spend the night. He found a relatively clean alley sheltered from the wind. There, sitting on his sleeping bag, the reality of his new situation hit him with full force. The sounds of the city seemed louder, the smells more intense. Hunger began to gnaw at him, something he hadn't experienced in a long time. The next morning, Edward woke up sore and tired. He washed his face in a public fountain and used a bathroom in a diner, pretending to be a customer. As he left, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the window. The man looking back at him was unrecognizable. Disheveled hair, unshaven beard, tired eyes. Edward Carson, the billionaire, had truly disappeared. In the days that followed, Edward learned the harsh lessons of life on the streets. He discovered where to get free meals, which shelters were the safest, and how to protect himself from the cold. He watched other homeless people, learning from their resilience and resourcefulness. Each day brought new challenges and revelations. One afternoon, while walking through Central Park, Edward saw a group of people gathered around a television in a shop window. It was a live broadcast of a charity event. His heart skipped a beat when he recognized the faces on the screen. His family. Tom and Brian were there, smiling for the cameras, making statements about generosity and social responsibility. Edward felt a wave of anger at his brother's hypocrisy, but then the camera focused on Jessica, his younger sister. She seemed genuinely moved as she spoke about the importance of helping the less fortunate. Edward stood there, watching, feeling a mix of emotions. He missed his old life, resented his brother's phoniness, and found a growing admiration for Jessica. He realized that, even in his previous life, he had never really paid attention to his sister's charity work. As he walked away from the crowd, Edward reflected on the contrast between his current situation and his family's luxurious life. He was dirty, hungry, and tired, while they sparkled under the flashlights. But for the first time, he wondered if he wasn't closer to the truth than he had ever been. That night, lying on a park bench, Edward made a decision. He would continue with his plan, but now with a new purpose. He wasn't just fleeing his old life. He was seeking to understand the true meaning of value and family, and perhaps find a way to make a difference, even without his money and status. With this resolution, Edward fell asleep, the sounds of the city around him like a strange lullaby. Tomorrow would be another day of discoveries, challenges, and, maybe, redemption. Weeks passed, and Edward gradually adapted to his new reality. He learned the rhythms of the streets, the safe places to sleep, and where to find help when needed. One day, he overheard other homeless people talking about a shelter that offered hot meals and a welcoming environment. Intrigued, Edward decided to investigate. Arriving at the location, he joined the line forming outside. The smell of hot soup hung in the air, making his stomach growl. As the line moved forward, Edward heard a familiar voice. His heart nearly stopped when he saw Jessica, his sister, serving meals with a warm smile on her face. Edward lowered his head, fearing recognition. But Jessica showed no sign of recognition as he approached to get his bowl of soup. She just smiled gently and said, "Enjoy your meal, sir. There's more if you'd like seconds." Sitting in a corner, Edward watched his sister interacting with others. She wasn't just serving food. She was talking, listening to stories, offering words of comfort. It was a side of Jessica he had never seen before, or maybe he had just never paid attention. In the days that followed, Edward returned to the shelter regularly, always keeping his distance, but observing Jessica. He noticed how she knew many people by name, remembered details about their lives, and how her face genuinely lit up when she saw progress in those she helped. One night, after dinner, Edward joined a group of homeless people talking in a corner of the shelter. An older man named Frank began to speak about his previous life as an executive at a major company. "I had everything," Frank said, his eyes distant. "Money, power, respect. But I lost it all because of alcohol and poor decisions. Now I look back and realize I was never truly happy in that life." Edward felt a lump in his throat. Frank's story echoed his own feelings. Impulsively, he began to speak. "I understand," Edward said, his voice hoarse. I also had a different life before. I thought I had everything, but in reality, I had nothing that truly mattered." The others looked at him with curiosity, but without judgment. Edward continued, careful not to reveal details that could identify him. "I was surrounded by people, but I felt completely alone. Everyone wanted something from me. No one really cared about me as a person." The conversation flowed, with others sharing their stories of loss, regret, and sometimes hope. Edward felt connected to these people in a way he had never experienced in his previous life. Inspired by Jessica and the stories he heard, Edward decided to become more actively involved in the shelter. He volunteered to help organize a fundraising event, using his business experience but disguising it as knowledge he'd picked up on the streets. Working behind the scenes, Edward helped plan the event, suggesting ideas to attract donors and maximize the funds raised. He watched Jessica leading the meetings, her passion and dedication evident in every word and gesture. As the event approached, Edward found himself increasingly invested in its success. It wasn't just about raising money, it was about making a difference in the lives of people he now considered friends. One night, while working late on the planning, Edward overheard Jessica speaking to herself in her office. He quietly approached the partially open door. "Oh, Edward," she whispered, looking at a photo of him on her desk. "I wish you could see this. I wish you could understand what really matters in life." Edward felt tears in his eyes. He wanted to go in, reveal himself, and hug his sister. But something held him back. His work here wasn't finished. He had more to learn, more to understand about himself and the true meaning of family and legacy. With a silent sigh, Edward walked away, determined to make the event a success, not for himself, but for Jessica and all the people the shelter helped. He was beginning to understand that true wealth wasn't in bank accounts, but in the bonds we create and the lives we touch. As the weeks leading up to the fundraiser flew by, the shelter was abuzz with activity. Edward, still keeping his identity a secret, threw himself into the preparations. He used his corporate event planning experience, disguised as ideas he'd heard around, to help transform the shelter's modest event into something larger and more impactful. One morning, Edward arrived early at the shelter and found Jessica already there, reviewing lists and making calls. He offered to help, careful not to reveal too much about his skills. "Thank you," Jessica said, smiling tiredly. "You know, it's amazing how you have so many good ideas for this event. It almost reminds me of my brother." Edward felt his heart race but kept his composure. "Your brother must be a smart man," he commented casually. Jessica sighed. "He was. Is. I don't know. Sometimes I wonder if he's still alive somewhere." Swallowing hard, Edward changed the subject, focusing on the day's tasks. They worked side by side, with Edward secretly marveling at his sister's dedication and compassion. As the event day approached, the excitement at the shelter was palpable. Volunteers decorated the space, transforming it with colorful ribbons and balloons. A local band volunteered to play for free, and several area restaurants donated food for the buffet. On the morning of the event, Edward woke up before dawn, feeling a mix of anxiety and excitement he hadn't felt in years. He arrived at the shelter early, helping with the final preparations. As the guests began to arrive, Edward stayed in the background, observing everything from a distance. He saw local business people, politicians, and even a few minor celebrities arriving, all drawn by the cause and the growing reputation of the shelter. Jessica gave a moving speech, talking about the importance of the shelter's work and how every donation made a difference in someone's life. Edward felt a surge of pride as he watched his sister, so eloquent and passionate. During the event, Edward discreetly circulated, listening to conversations and observing guests' reactions. He was surprised by how much genuine interest there was in the cause, with many guests asking detailed questions about how they could help further. At one point, Edward overheard two businessmen talking. "You know, I came here expecting to just make a quick donation and leave," one said. "But now, seeing all this work, I'm thinking of getting more involved." The other nodded. "Me too. There's something special happening here. You can feel it." Edward smiled to himself. This was exactly the kind of impact he had hoped the event would have. As the night wore on, it became clear that the event was a resounding success. Donations exceeded all expectations, and several attendees committed to ongoing support for the shelter. At the end of the night, Edward saw Jessica in a quiet corner, tears of joy in her eyes as she looked out at the full hall. He approached her cautiously. "It was a great success," he said softly. Jessica turned to him, smiling through her tears. "It was incredible. I can't believe this is going to change so many lives." Impulsively, she hugged Edward. For a moment he tensed, fearing recognition, but then relaxed in his sister's embrace. "Thank you for all your help," Jessica said as she pulled away. "We couldn't have done it without you." Edward felt a lump in his throat. "It was my pleasure," he managed to say. As Jessica walked away to thank the last guests, Edward stood there, watching. He felt moved in a way he hadn't experienced in years. Here, in this shelter, with these people, he had found something that all his money could never buy: a sense of purpose, community, and the ability to make a real difference in people's lives. That night, lying in his sleeping bag in a quiet alley, Edward reflected on the event. He thought of Jessica, how she shone when talking about the shelter's work. He thought of the smiling faces of the volunteers and the gratitude of the homeless who would benefit. For the first time since leaving his old life behind, Edward felt truly at peace. He had made the right choice by stepping away from his life of luxury, he realized. Here, on the streets, helping real people with real problems, he was finally living a life with meaning. With a smile on his face, Edward drifted off to sleep. Excited for what the future held, he knew his journey was far from over, but he was certain he was on the right path. Weeks after the successful fundraising event, Edward's life had found a new rhythm. He continued his work at the shelter, now more involved than ever, while keeping a distant eye on developments in his family. One day, Edward heard rumors of a family meeting to discuss the inheritance. Driven by curiosity and concern, he decided to approach the Carson family mansion discreetly, where the meeting was to take place. Hidden behind some bushes in the garden, Edward could see and hear through the open living room window. Tom, Brian, and Jessica were there, along with a few lawyers. The tension in the air was palpable. Tom was the first to speak, his voice full of false concern. "It's been months since Edward disappeared. We need to make decisions about the company's future and the family fortune." Brian agreed, adding with a calculated tone, Our lawyers found a document suggesting that Edward wanted the two of us to take control in his absence. Edward felt his blood boil at Brian's blatant lie. He watched Jessica, hoping to see her reaction. Jessica frowned, clearly suspicious. What document is this? Why didn't Edward mention this to me? Tom tried to calm the situation. Jessica, dear, you know how reserved Edward was about these things. Besides, you've always been more interested in your charity work than in the family business. Edward saw the hurt expression on Jessica's face and felt a pang of guilt. He had never realized how his actions could have made his sister feel excluded. The discussion continued, with Tom and Brian presenting increasingly elaborate arguments to justify their claim to the inheritance. Jessica, though clearly uncomfortable, seemed to struggle to find words to oppose her older brothers. In a particularly tense moment, Brian implied that Jessica's dedication to the shelter was merely a way to polish her public image, to eventually claim a larger share of the inheritance. Edward saw Jessica's face go pale with the accusation. "How can you say that?" she exclaimed. "You know how much that work means to me." Tom intervened, his voice soft but manipulative. "Jessica, we understand that you care about these people, but think about the greater good. With control of the family fortune, we could make much larger donations to causes like yours." Edward watched, horrified, as his brothers tried to manipulate Jessica. He could see the doubt and confusion in her eyes, and he felt an overwhelming need to intervene, to expose Tom and Brian's lies. But something held him back. He knew that revealing himself now could cause more problems than it would solve. Besides, a part of him wanted to see how Jessica would handle the situation on her own. The meeting continued for several more hours, with the lawyers presenting documents and the brothers heatedly debating. Jessica, though clearly troubled, held firm in her position that any decision should be fair and respect Edward's wishes. When the meeting finally ended, Edward saw his brothers leaving the house, Tom and Brian with satisfied smiles, Jessica with a concerned and thoughtful expression. Edward remained hidden for a while, processing everything he had heard. He felt disgusted by Tom and Brian's greed and manipulation, but proud of Jessica's integrity. That night, back at his corner in the shelter, Edward couldn't sleep. He knew that the situation was reaching a critical point. Tom and Brian were willing to go too far in their quest for the family fortune, and Jessica was alone, trying to uphold the Carson legacy. Edward realized he could no longer stay hidden in the shadows. He needed to do something, to intervene somehow. But how? Revealing himself now could cause an immense shock and potentially harm the work Jessica was doing at the shelter. As the sun rose, Edward made a decision. He would find a way to expose Tom and Brian's lies without fully revealing himself. And more importantly, he would find a way to support Jessica and protect the true legacy of their family, not the money or the power, but the values of compassion and service that she embodied so well. With that resolution, Edward finally fell asleep, his mind already working on a plan for the days ahead. The battle for the soul of the Carson family was about to reach its climax. In the days following the family meeting, Edward struggled internally with his decision. He knew he needed to act, but he wanted to do so in a way that would cause as little negative impact as possible. After much reflection, he decided that the only way to resolve the situation was to confront his family directly. Edward spent the next few days preparing meticulously. He obtained clean, decent clothes, threw donations at the shelter, trimmed his beard, and cut his hair. Looking at himself in the mirror of a public restroom, he barely recognized the man staring back, a curious blend of his old self and the person he had become on the streets. On the morning of the chosen day, Edward made his way to the family mansion. His heart pounded as he climbed the familiar steps. Taking a deep breath, he rang the doorbell. The housekeeper who answered the door nearly fainted at the sight of him. "Mr. Edward?" she stammered, incredulous. "Hello, Martha," Edward replied softly. "Is my family home?" Minutes later, Edward entered the living room where Tom, Brian, and Jessica were gathered, apparently discussing business. The silence that fell over the room was deafening. Jessica was the first to react. With a muffled cry, she ran to Edward and hugged him, tears streaming down her face. "Edward! Oh my God, Edward! You're alive!" Tom and Brian remained frozen, their expressions a mixture of shock and, Edward noted with disgust, calculation. When Jessica finally let go, Edward looked at his brothers. "Tom, Brian," he said, his voice steady, "I think we have a lot to talk about." The next few moments were chaotic. Jessica alternated between crying with joy and asking 1,000 questions. Tom and Brian, recovering from the initial shock, began to stammer explanations and justifications for their recent actions. Edward raised his hand, silencing them all. "I know about the fake will," he said calmly. "I know about your plans to take control of the company and the family fortune." Tom's face paled, while Brian stammered in denial. Jessica looked at her brothers, horrified. "How do you—" Tom began, but Edward cut him off. "That doesn't matter now. What matters is that I've seen and heard enough in the past few weeks to understand exactly what's going on here." Edward then began to tell his story, how he had faked his own death, lived on the streets, and observed his family from afar. He spoke about what he had learned about himself, about the true value of life and family. Jessica listened with tears in her eyes, occasionally squeezing Edward's hand in support. Tom and Brian, on the other hand, grew increasingly uncomfortable as Edward revealed how much he knew about their plans. "I could have come back sooner," Edward concluded, "but I needed to see who you really were, without my presence influencing your actions." He turned to Jessica. "You surprised me, Jess. Your dedication to the shelter, your compassion. You understood the true meaning of our family's legacy better than I ever did." Then, he faced Tom and Brian. "As for you two, I am deeply disappointed, but I also understand that part of this is my fault. I created an environment where money and power seemed like everything that mattered." The silence that followed was heavy. Tom and Brian seemed diminished, the reality of their actions finally sinking in. Jessica held Edward's hand, still processing everything she had heard. "What happens now?" Brian asked, his voice barely a whisper. Edward sighed. "Now, we start over. As a family, not based on money or power, but on real values, on making a difference in the world." He looked at each of his siblings. "I'm willing to forgive, to start anew, but things are going to change, radically. Are you ready for that?" The silence that followed was broken by the sound of Jessica sobbing and hugging Edward again. Tom and Brian exchanged glances, the reality of their situation finally setting in. Edward knew that the road ahead would be difficult. There was much to resolve, many wounds to heal. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hope. Hope that his family could heal, that they could use their wealth and influence to do real good in the world. As the afternoon sun bathed the room through the windows, Edward Carson finally felt at home. Not in the physical house, but in the home he had found in his heart, on the streets of New York. And now, he hoped, in a renewed and redeemed family. In the weeks following Edward's revelation, the Carson family began to walk a new path. The mansion, once a symbol of wealth and status, became a center of planning and action for philanthropic initiatives. One sunny morning found the four siblings gathered in the office that once belonged to their father. Jessica, with a determined gleam in her eye, took the lead in presenting an idea she had been developing. "I've been thinking," she began, spreading some papers across the table. "What if we used our fortune to really make a difference, starting with the shelter?" Edward, sitting at the head of the table, nodded encouragingly. "Go on, Jess. What do you have in mind?" Jessica smiled, her passion evident. "We could expand the shelter, transform it into a full-fledged community center. Offer not just shelter but education, job training, healthcare." Tom, who in recent weeks had shown a growing interest in Jessica's initiatives, leaned forward. "That would require a significant investment, but I think we could make it work." Brian, who had been quiet until then, added, "And why stop there? We could replicate this model in other cities, create a network of community centers." Edward watched his siblings with a mix of pride and hope. The change in them was palpable. Tom, once obsessed with profits, now spoke of social investment. Brian, who used to shirk responsibility, proposed an ambitious expansion. "These are excellent ideas," Edward said, "but I'd like to suggest something additional. I think we should create a foundation in memory of our parents, something that encapsulates the values they tried to teach us, and which, I admit, took me a long time to understand." The suggestion was met with enthusiastic nods. Jessica quickly picked up a notepad and began sketching ideas. "We could call it the Carson Foundation for Community Progress," she suggested. "Focused not just on charity, but on empowerment and sustainable development." As the siblings animatedly discussed the foundation and plans for the community center, Edward couldn't help but notice the transformation in Tom and Brian. The greed that had once consumed them seemed to have given way to a genuine desire to make a difference. Tom, noticing Edward's gaze, paused. "You know, Ed," he said, his voice tinged with emotion, "I never thought I'd say this, but thank you for making us see what really matters." Brian nodded in agreement. "I feel alive in a way I haven't felt in years, like we're finally doing something that's worth it." Edward felt a lump in his throat. "Don't thank me," he said softly. "Thank Jessica. She never lost sight of what was truly important." Jessica blushed at the praise, but her smile was radiant. "We're a team now," she said. "Each of us brings something unique to the table." As the discussion continued, it became clear that Tom and Brian's internal struggles hadn't completely disappeared. Occasionally, Edward noticed flashes of their old behavior, a comment about maximizing return on investment here, a concern about public image there. But now, these tendencies were quickly redirected toward more noble goals. Tom spoke of using his negotiation skills to secure corporate partnerships for the foundation. Brian suggested using his contacts to increase the visibility of the initiatives and attract more support. Edward, watching it all, felt a deep satisfaction. The journey was far from over, he knew. There would be challenges ahead, moments of doubt, and possibly even relapses into old habits. But the most important thing was that they were in this together, united by a purpose larger than themselves. When the meeting ended, the four Carson siblings found themselves standing in front of their parents' portrait on the office wall. For a moment, they stood in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. It was Jessica who finally spoke, her voice soft but determined. "They would be proud of us, of what we're becoming." Edward put an arm around his sister's shoulders. "Yes, they would," he agreed. "And this is just the beginning." As they left the office, ready to turn their ideas into action, Edward felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. The true legacy of the Carsons wasn't the money or the business empire. It was the ability to make a difference, to use their resources for the greater good. And now, finally, they were ready to embrace that legacy with all their hearts. Weeks passed as the Carson family continued working on their new philanthropic projects. The community center was in full development, and the plans for the Carson Foundation for Community Progress were nearly finalized. The atmosphere in the mansion was one of optimism and renewed purpose. One sunny afternoon, the four siblings gathered in the office for a meeting with the family lawyer, Mr. Jameson. What seemed like a simple formality to legally establish the foundation would soon become a moment that changed everything once again. Mr. Jameson, a middle-aged man with thin-rimmed glasses, entered the room carrying a thick folder. His usually impassive face showed signs of nervousness. "Mr. Carson, Ms. Carson," he began, clearing his throat. "Before we proceed with the foundation documents, there's something I need to share with you. Something your father instructed me to reveal only under these specific circumstances." Silence fell over the room. Edward exchanged intrigued looks with his siblings. "What is it, Mr. Jameson?" Edward asked, feeling a strange apprehension. The lawyer opened his folder and pulled out a sealed document. "It's a will, Mr. Edward. A will your father made shortly before he passed, with explicit instructions that it be opened only when you four were united in a genuinely altruistic purpose." The words hung in the air, heavy with implications. Jessica gasped softly, while Tom and Brian leaned forward, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. With trembling hands, Mr. Jameson opened the envelope and began to read. "I, William Carson, being of sound mind, declare this as my last will and testament. To my beloved children, Edward, Thomas, Brian, and Jessica, I leave not only my fortune, but a challenge and an opportunity. If this will is being read, it means that you have finally understood the true meaning of our family legacy. It is not the money or the business power that defines the Carsons, but our ability to make a difference in the world. Therefore, I declare that the entirety of my fortune, with the exception of a small provision for each of you, is to be transferred to a foundation dedicated to philanthropic causes. The exact nature of these causes, I trust you to determine together." The shock in the room was palpable. Edward felt as though the ground had been pulled out from under him. All his sacrifice, his journey of self-discovery. His father had anticipated it all? Mr. Jameson continued reading, detailing how a small portion of the fortune would be equally divided among the four siblings, ensuring each had comfort but not excess. The remainder, the vast majority, would go to the foundation. When the lawyer finished, the silence in the room was deafening. Edward looked at his siblings, trying to gauge their reactions. Jessica had tears in her eyes, a trembling smile on her lips. Tom looked stunned, while Brian had a distant expression as if processing everything. It was Tom who finally broke the silence. "So, all this time, Dad knew? He expected us to reach this point?" Edward nodded slowly. "It seems so. He gave us the chance to discover for ourselves the true value of our inheritance." Brian let out a disbelieving laugh. "And to think we were planning, looks like the old man outsmarted us in the end." Jessica stood, walking to their parents' portrait. "He knew we would eventually do the right thing. He believed in us." Edward felt a wave of conflicting emotions. Pride in a father who had such foresight, shame for taking so long to understand, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility for what lay ahead. "So," he said, looking at each of his siblings, "what do we do now?" Tom, surprising everyone, was the first to answer. "We do exactly what we planned, only now, on a much larger scale." Brian agreed. "The Carson Foundation for Community Progress. That's what we were meant to do all along." Jessica smiled through her tears. "Dad would be proud. Not just of what we're going to do, but that we came to this together." Edward looked at his siblings, feeling a surge of affection and pride. They had been through so much: greed, distrust, betrayal, but in the end, they had found their way back to each other and to the true purpose of their family. "Together then," Edward said, extending his hand. Without hesitation, Jessica, Tom, and Brian placed their hands on top of his. Together, they repeated in unison. As Mr. Jameson discreetly left the room, allowing the family to process the news, Edward looked once more at his father's portrait. He could swear he saw a glint of approval in his father's painted eyes. The true journey of the Carsons was just beginning. They had the power to make a real difference in the world, and now, finally, they had the vision and unity to do so. Edward smiled. The inheritance at stake had never really been about money. It was about family, purpose, and the power to change lives. And now, they were ready to embrace that legacy with all their hearts.